morning, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. I know it's been a long week for some of you already, even though it does feel like this is just day 1.5. Thank you so much to my panelists here. So we are here this morning to talk about a really crucial topic. We're here to talk about what the world needs now, feminist funding as an essential component to ASAR, HR, and justice. I'm Amrita Batnal. I'm a senior editor at DevEx. I cover global health amongst other issues in foreign aid. And this is a very important topic, both domestically and in terms of foreign aid. So I'm really glad we're having this conversation. As I was speaking to some of my panelists this morning, they also informed me that money and funding and at this level, at this sort of granularity, is something that is only beginning to be talked about now. So I'm very happy that we're here in this room and with this audience who's really interested in listening to what all of us have to say, your experiences, and we'll also look forward to hearing your thoughts later. So we'll dive right in. I'm just going to give a quick introduction to all my panelists, and then we can get started. I'm joined by Bing Parkon, the Executive Director of Women's Global Network for Reproductive Rights, Sivananthi Thanantiram, the Executive Director of Arrow. We're here also with Metse Ainekulu, the AY-SRH Director at PSI Ethiopia. I'm here with Ankit Gupta, Program Officer for the Global Fund for Women, and Althea Anderson, who's a Program Officer at the William and Flora Hewlett Foundation. Thank you so much for being here. So, like I said, this is something that is not new, but hasn't really been talked about. So just to sort of get the ground running, to get the basics out, I want to hear from all of you. What does feminist funding mean to your organization and from the vantage point that you're operating from in this space?
Good morning, everyone. As a Global South organization, what is actually feminist funding mean to us? For us, feminist funding is actually, an opportunity for us. That values our work in the Global South, that has that kind of horizontal partnership, and we have mutual respect to our work, that we are not seen as just the receiving end, and we are just not, the grantee, but actually partners in changing, doing transformative work at the grassroots level. And it also talks about accountability. Both are accountable to women and girls in all their diversity. And that, for us, is actually what is feminist funding is a political act. This is an act where it challenges the status quo. It challenges, the aid regime where everyone is actually just focused into one thing and not sustainable. And this is something that the feminist funding is actually really contributing to the whole aid regime at this point.
Yeah, thanks, Bing. And I also wanted to add, is feminist funding a new thing, right? And actually, it's not. If we remember all the great successes of the international development sector, the great conferences of Vienna Human Rights Conference, of ICPD in Cairo, of Beijing, this was actually about the very first seeds, right, of how women's rights organizations across the world were funded. Participants from women's organizations were funded to go to conferences to kind of help develop the global development agenda, so to speak, right? But then what happened? Right? So what happens is we have the development agendas, and then the development agendas and the language of the development agendas kind of get co-opted by the development sector, and in many countries what we saw is the birth of the corporatization of of this development agenda, right? And then when that happened, it kind of replicated the type of structural inequalities between the global north and the global south. And what we saw is, even if we talk about global health as in family planning and maternal health, in many countries of this world, there is this huge funding that is available, but all of these services rest and are carried out by unpaid Black and brown women, whether they are lady health volunteer workers, whether it's the ASHA regime, and all of that, right? So in that, we can actually see that the inequality, that structural inequality is being replicated. And just like, for example, like Bing says, right, that feminist funding is a political action, is a political ideology, because we are not going to reach sustainability for this agenda if we did not invert that triangle, which rests on unpaid care work of brown and black women, and actually say, let's prioritize them. Let's make sure that those community groups are funded, those women are funded, right? So that's, I think, our experience with it.
Thank you. My name is Matseta Nakulu, with PSI for almost 7 years now, working on adolescent and young people's sexual reproductive health. PSI is a big organization with more than 50 years of experience, working at 45 different countries, with women and for girls, actually. And there is this notion of considering ourselves as feminists because we are working with and for women and girls in most cases. But the question is, are we? So feminist philanthropy for us as an NGO is all about looking inward and question ourselves, are we committed enough to this cause in a very pragmatic way? Are we walking the talk? Because it involves the way we exercise power and how we are perceived by the local organizations we are closely working with. Because our role is mainly receiving funding from those big organizations and acting as a pseudo donors to our local organizations and local movement. So we're not sure how we are perceived by our local partners. Are we allowing them, or are we enablers to help the local organizations and community-based movements to exercise their inherent power they have? Because believe me, local organizations are already powerful enough when they decide to come out and talk about those sensitive issues. Thank you.
Thank you. My name is Ankit Gupta. I work with Global Fund Women as a program officer. I think feminist philanthropy for us, first of all, is based in trust. I think there's no feminist philanthropy without trust-based philanthropy. And I think agreeing with everything you've already said, it is a political act. And I think feminist philanthropy for me is one that believes your grantee partners, your partners know what's best for them, what's best for their communities, and giving them resources to do so. For me, it's based in co-support, multi-year, flexible funding, and funding that is intersectional, that is looking at multiple movements because people don't live single issue lives. And looking at intersection of marginalization is important when we're looking at feminist funding, and reaching communities that are most marginalized, however you do so. And I think the last thing I want to say is I think COVID has shown us the importance that feminist funding holds in our life, the importance that flexibility holds, because things can change overnight and your grantee partners need to be able to adapt to that. And I think what we learned during COVID, I think for me, something like mutual aid where communities are taking care of each other, making sure your communities are fed and have resources they need, is a form of feminist funding as well, where it's not top down, but it's looking at us, ourselves as communities, ourselves as one. And I think that for me is basis of feminist philanthropy.
Can you hear me now? Okay, wonderful. So I agree, obviously, with all of my panelists, and I'm going to go off script, which is never a good idea. What feminist? Hello?
Hello.
Okay, this one's working now.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you, Bing.
Apologies. Okay. So I'm going to share what feminist funding means to me and also what it means for the William and Flora Hewlett Foundation. So one, it's important to know that Hewlett as a funder is fairly new to the feminist funding ecosystem, which exists. We have funded feminist movements in small ways, but not strategically and not explicitly. We have undergone 3 strategy refreshes in our gender equity and governance program over the last 3 years. And in all 3 of those refreshes, we have now, because we are being responsive to the field, very explicitly said that funding feminist movements is something that is centered in those strategies on good governance practice, another strategy on women's economic empowerment, and a strategy on global reproductive equity. With that, I would also say that there is a community of funders, both private foundation, some bilateral funders, women's funds, community funds, that very explicitly integrate feminist principles in their funding practices. And then there is the wider group of philanthropic organizations that fund gender equality. And I think it might be important during this conversation to distinguish between what does it mean to integrate feminist principles into philanthropy, which is very different than funding gender equality. Yeah.
This is switched on. I guess now it is. Okay. Thanks so much for all of you for being candid. I think it's also great that we have a range of speakers here. I mean, some of you work in the global south, you're kind of funding and you're looking at it from the top-down perspective. So like you said, it'd be great to, again, unpack that through the rest of this conversation. So my next question is to you, Bing and Siva, like as organizations, like you were saying before, as receiving the funding, what is your experience like of getting funding that is truly feminist in nature, and what does that actually mean in practice?
Truly feminist in nature. Yeah, I just have to talk about what is our experience as WGNR sitting in the Global South. We are based in the Philippines and also in Tanzania. How does it look like for us when it comes to fundraising? It is difficult, and I'm telling you, everyone in the room would also agree with that it is actually really difficult, specifically in the topic that we are working in. We're working on sexual and reproductive health and rights with focus on abortion rights, and is difficult. And in terms of before, even when the OECD actually categorized the whole world into lower middle income countries, it was difficult. But then when that happened, all of us sitting in the global south, it all became more and more difficult to access funding. It's as if that, we in the global south actually are already having equality. It's just as if, discrimination doesn't happen anymore. It's just as if we already have access to safe and legal abortion. It's not. But then when this categorization, the funding also were categorized, and it actually limited our capacity to fundraise. And so what we are doing as an experience is that we join, we work in solidarity with other feminists in the region for us to be able to access feminist fund. And this is where actually the feminist philanthropy comes in. When there is limited capacity in the global south, specifically funding for contentious issues on SRHR, that's where we can access all those, although very small amount of money that we are actually accessing. But this actually really is very meaningful in our work. In our work in the Philippines, we do work for the decriminalization of abortion. And this feminist funding actually really help us, to get that work within the grassroots level. What we need is actually really to make sure that the grassroots communities are engaged, that we are transformative in all we do. It should be, sustainable. Social change doesn't happen overnight. You know, it takes a long time, and this is what the principles of feminist philanthropy actually comes in. Yeah.
Siva, just to sort of add on to that question, right? How is it different for you, experiencing it from the kind of vantage point that you have? And again, what sort of approaches have you used towards funders to sort of convince them uh, to adopt this approach?
Yeah. So, okay. So, one of the things I think is a mark of feminist funding is to fund strategic plans of organizations rather than go towards like, just project or thematic types of funding, right? And that's because a lot of feminist organizations actually believe that we consult our partners and we set the strategy together. And we don't want to be stuck in a place where, I can only fund definitely, or work with partners in South Asia because South Asia is the darling of donors. In Southeast Asia, somehow, with economic development, all our women are equal and everyone has access to everything, right? Which is just not the reality. And of course, the demands from the field, just like the other speakers have spoken, right? We can see that inequality is really increasing, that intersectional approach is really essential. So even in countries where there is probably some good health care, and there, like, even if abortion is legal, there's still, marginalized groups which are being left out. And our idea of marginalization is that, oh, this is a small proportion. It's not. I mean, if we're talking about adolescent girls not being able, this is a large number of people who are being marginalized from services, right? So we would be able to like kind of fund across all different countries, whether you're low income, middle income, or Malaysia right now claims to be high income nation, which is not real. I mean, like maybe there is 1% of this population who is really, really high income and on par with the rest of the world. But, most of the population does not enjoy that status, right? So that's one. So the strategic plan. And of course, because we have these demands of inequality across the regions, this justice approach is really critical. And many funders will say, oh, well, what are you going to, like in the case of Women's Global Network, what on earth are you going to do about abortion in the Philippines? But women in the Philippines need abortions, right? So it needs to be provided. We need to think of it. So even if the even if the contexts are difficult and not conducive, or I guess in philanthropic organizations, people are thinking about what is the strategy like? Where can we get the biggest wins? Well, the biggest wins is like, when women are empowered, even in the most regressive context. But so how do we define the win? Has got to change. What do we define as a result and outcome? We have to change. Because actually, if we look at it, as a development sector, we may only have very few years left, with this whole idea of philanthropy. So I would suggest that, we just go that last mile very quickly if, we want to actually have made some sort of difference in our lives. Yeah.
Thank you, Siva. Althea, if I could come to you next and sort of have you respond to what Siva and Bing said. And also, you said that the Hewlett Foundation has had this sort of change over the last 3 years. If you could take us a little bit behind the scenes to kind of understand what that change has looked like and how do you, again, face these challenges that you hear from partner organizations?
Happily. Can you hear me? Okay, very good. One, my response is, again, like in full agreement. And I think a few things. The call for funding feminist movements, I think one of the catchphrases that we've heard recently is fund us like you want us to win. So what does that look like? As Ankit said, it looks like general operating support, multi-year support, organizational effectiveness support, which includes strategic planning support. Hewlett has been around for over 55 years. And in that time, this is how we fund. What has changed is who we fund. So we have provided core support to partners throughout our history. We have a whole nother funding source, which is organizational effectiveness funding, in addition to our core support funding. But our funding has been, we are a development funder. That is how, in the spectrum of different types of philanthropy, we have been on the side of development funders. And again, I think we've had to really look deeply and interrogate um, how we think about how change happens. Um, we have had long-term partnerships, and we really value that. But it also means that there are other people who are under-resourced, other types of change actors like feminist movements who couldn't establish relationships with the Hewlett Foundation because we were already partnering with other people for 20, 30 years. And so as we have like tried to learn and hear, from not only our direct partners, sometimes they are international NGOs, but also from their partners, which are considered sometimes implementing partners, about what the needs are, the type of funding they need. We have really like to go behind the curtain. One of the things we've done is we are trying to fund movements directly, but there's also like, we have a lean staffing model. And so if we have a budget of $20 million a year, there are two people trying to program that $20 million. There is absolutely no way that I can make 200 grants in 1 year. So we work through some form of partner. It could be women's funds that have the capacity to do that, or other intermediary bodies. And one of the things I've really tried to look very deeply into is these relationships between those who do onward granting and the types of values and principles that they bring to that. If I was to give core support to an organization that had the capacity to do onward granting, what is the type of relationship that that partner has? And this is what I say, if I was to fund a small civil society organization, a grassroots women's organization directly, I would give them core support, I would give them organizational effectiveness support. So if I am working through an intermediary grant making model, my expectation is that my partner is going to partner with that grassroots organization in the same way. This way of operating has been really difficult because the business models of many large organizations, funders have done this. We have created this project-based way of thinking. And to dismantle and really disrupt that is super difficult because it's been decades that this is how we've worked. And to unlearn that has been really difficult. And now philanthropy is in this position, like, we have everyone expecting like we're going to work in this really new way. And I'm sure you will say it has been very, very difficult, but we are like saying we are being responsive to the field and we have to move in this direction.
Thank you so much. Ankit, if you want to respond to that, and also I'd like to understand, working in India and also with different partners, how do partners respond to this sort of shift in philanthropic thinking?
No, I think what you've said covered it all. I completely agree. I think it's challenging. I think as of Women's Fund, I want to reiterate what you said about how funding for feminist and women-led organizations is different for funding for gender equality. 1.6% of total gender equality funding goes to women-led organizations, uh, which includes women's funds and feminist funds. So we as intermediaries and public fund that also receives funding has to navigate that when we're doing funding, and sometimes we receive project funding which we do not want to manage because we do co-funding, but for our grantee partners have to also respond to those requests. So I think that's a big challenge for us, but also I just want to talk a bit about challenges as well, because we pride ourselves for funding in countries with oppressed and closed civil society. According to Civicus model, 84% of our funding goes to groups in closed civil society countries. And it's been incredibly difficult to fund in most of the countries we work in. Looking at India, Nicaragua, Argentina, just countries are very increasingly introducing more and more regulations and laws that make it completely impossible for small feminist groups to receive funding from outside the country to do their work and do the mobilization and the movement building that is needed. Um, and I think this is to challenge ourselves as well as funders. I think uh, as Althea said, we have the capacity to fund small groups, but so many movements have never had funding. If we look at intersex group, we've never funded intersex groups for the longest time. And 2 years ago, when I started doing outreach, they would think an invite for proposal from Global Fund for Women was a spam email. So I would reach out to them on WhatsApp and Instagram and Snapchat, and they'd be like, "Oh, we didn't really see your email. We thought it was a spam." We'd respond as soon as possible. But I think we have to change how we're doing things to reach out to small, marginalized communities who don't have the mechanisms. Usually they have 2 volunteers who have full-time jobs, who are running these organizations. So I think this entire model of how we do work needs to be relooked at. And I would say we do that actively, but I don't think we're anywhere near an end line here.
Right. Metse, I know you talked about how this is an uncomfortable conversation to have, even internally. So if you could sort of expand a little bit more on that while talking about the challenges that you face also in your organization.
Thank you so much. I was actually fascinated when Althea was talking about the challenges. If the donors are challenged to this level, you can imagine the stress it will have on us. So, I mean, to begin with, the challenge, the biggest challenge is not knowing where to start. Because as I said, PSI is a big organization. Having this huge presence within the SRHR ecosystem, working with the private sector, with the local movement and community-based organizations, public health system, and also donor communities. So having that complexity and trying to push this agenda, the question is where to start. That's number one. And the second one is, like, as Althea said, we are used to do, to certain way of working or doing the business. However, feminist philanthropy is requiring us to shake that a bit, not a bit, maybe significantly. And it's uncomfortable, if not uncertain. Is it really not questioning even our existence as INGOs? Because our vision is to make sure that the power on funding is moving from the donors to the doers. We are people-centered organizations. Our program design and implementation is centering people all the time, so the funding should be as well. And it can be, but there must be a clear pathway, and we are not sure on that pathway. So what we did within PSI was, since 2020, we set up this mechanism called Maverick Impact Portfolio. We brought a group of incredible women to give us some money to set up a pool fund. We collaborated with a huge movement organization, a consortium of more than 140 organizations called First Feminista. And we're trying to leverage their expertise in the feminist philanthropy so that they can help us navigate that pathway. But as I said, it's uncertain, and we're not sure how it looks like, and for sure we will be having wrong turns. So what we tell to our donors is to have that shared risk-taking, and also give us flexibility in terms of time, as well as the way the funding is channeled. Our criteria on funding should be simple and also fun, because these community-based organizations are already in a stressful situation where they're navigating through their own environment. They're having this scrutiny from their own government. So it should be fun and simple. Thank you.
Fun is not something that you equate with criteria and measurements and evidence in this community. So thank you so much for bringing that up. Siva, coming to you next.
Holding the mic.
Yeah, because since you are, how does an organization like yours sort of then look at these power dynamics and navigate your way around that? What has the process been like? Because, like you said, this is not a new conversation. We're talking about it more and more now, which is great. But how have you navigated it?
Yeah. I think that, I just wanted to follow up from what Metse said, there should be the fun in the fund. So everyone should like, yeah. So I think that this power dynamics is really a very, critical issues for all of us to be navigating, and Medse, I mean, like, you articulated it so clearly that even, within the INGO structure, right? And I mean, when I come to SRHR, honestly, I think I have a broad heart and a broad mind as possible. I mean, all of us need to be in the ecosystem because we can see that services, whether it's to access to contraception, whether it's access to abortion, all of it is contested across all of it. I would like all of the organizations to keep flourishing. But within all of our own organization, INGO, as well as regional organizations and national organizations, we kind of replicate the systems of power dynamics, and part of my own journey has been in the most recent years is to interrogate my own privilege in my own society as well, right? And how do we all create, greater inclusivity, greater diversity within the work we do, who we work with, like, Ankit was saying. I mean, like, and it's not to say that we were doing it wrong, right? Because feminism is not for me, it's not just a brand, right? Feminism is a process, right? Feminist principles are a process of being and becoming, and a commitment to improve ourselves. And then, of course, as like you have demonstrated, INGOs also have to go through that process of transformation because that transformation will be demanded of us, okay? Because that's what the younger generation is doing to us, right? And it's great because they're holding us accountable, whether we are working in the, honorable, the high moral ground of the NGO development sector, and they're holding us true to the principles that we are espousing. So I feel like, this power dynamics is forever, and we should, I mean, and it's easy to go into a room and say, okay, all you white people like this and all you brown people like this, but it's not that, each one of us is accompanying positions of power and privilege and oppression simultaneously, So I think that, that commitment, maybe that thinking about ourselves in our society. But I feel like, I must say that there there have been and there are good funders out there, people who have always listened to us and talked to us, but it's just not, and I guess in the funding community, then that power dynamics conversation needs to be promoted, so.
That's really important. And this idea of, knowing that these conversations are happening and kind of trying to figure out who to talk to, who's the right person, which organization will be the right one to tap into. Bing, have you had these sort of conversations internally and with other organizations such as yours to sort of create a network almost? And is it an informal network?
Yes, there are actually one of the best ways, and I think we actually not perfected this, but we have been trying to do this as an organization, is to really work in partnership, work in solidarity with the others, to be able to maximize our impact. And to be honest, in this whole funding, landscape that we have right now, while it is very limited, we can maximize our impact by actually in working in partnership, to be in collaboration with each other and not in competition with each other. For the longest time, feminist organizations are actually accessing different funding facilities, and we are in competition with each other for the longest time, and we are still into that kind of level at this point, which for me, one of the best ways that has been done in the recent past is also working closely with Arrow, for example, for a joint fundraising for safe abortion rights. And this is actually something that we have to leverage. We have different skill set. We have different target groups. We are located in different areas. We are not the work in SRHR is vast. It's not something that if I do, for example, adolescent sexuality, I will take away the adolescent sexuality work of Arrow or of PSI. This is actually really, complementing each other's work. And I think as a matter of strategy, that's where we as feminists should go. That kind of mindset that we have to break. And that's where also the, feminist philanthropy can come in and to support the trust building, that partnership, that horizontal partnership and mutual respect and the work that we do that would actually go to the, shared accountability. Yeah.
Can I just add something? Sorry. I mean, like, I think that whenever we come into these spaces, we keep thinking, oh, funding is limited, and hence we're all competitors. So we need to, like, kind of, oh, sorry, we need to, like, kind of, like, move away from that thinking. Because if we look at it, there is a heck of a lot of money in this world today. In fact, there's more money in the world today than there ever has been, right? So how do we channel that money? So what we need to do is we need to make that bigger pie. Instead of saying like, oh, if there is money for this, it needs to go to me, we have to say that there needs to be money for all women and for all girls and all marginalized communities, LGBTI persons, and for all services that are required. So we need to like think, how can we make that bigger pie? Instead of saying who should have a slice of that small pie I think the shift that needs to happen.
Althea, as the person with the pie, what do you think of that?
Althea does not have the whole pie, but I really do want to speak to this point of like scarcity mentality and competition, how funders foster that, and like how we disrupt that. One, the pie is not small because if we think about even the Generation Equality Forum commitments, many of them were not new commitments. It was money that was already committed. We are talking about billions of dollars, right? Right. So that is not a small pie. But like feminist movements have been getting the little tiny money over here. And I think one of the things, just as a funder in my bird's eye view, is that it's like there was kind of an understanding like there's a lot of money coming into gender equality now. A lot of that will be focused on feminist movements. And all of a sudden, everybody was a feminist. And like, so one of the things that I really tried in partnership and also just in like, let's be honest, is like, there are people doing this work, putting their lives on the line, dying because they are under-resourced, couldn't take care of themselves, dying for the causes, who have been doing this work, and now there's new money coming in. If you're gonna hop in front of them and say like, so these power dynamics even within the gender equality space really need to be discussed and to be talking about like, how do we resource people who have been on the front lines of this for a long period of time. We can all be individual feminists in our organizations, but when we're talking about grassroots feminist movements and supporting them, we're talking about a particular group of people that may not be in direct relationship with development funders, may not be in relation, there may be more relationship with human rights funders. And so this kind of interrogating, like how do we create those partnerships from an ecosystems lens, and to really talk about this pie that is much bigger, is around complementarity, but also you're gonna have to share. Because like, I mean, that is just the truth. That even with 40 billion, it's gonna be divided up differently than it has been previously, and we're all gonna have to bend in order for that to happen.
Metsi, if I could come to you next, as Maverick Collective, is this a conversation that happens internally as well to sort of think about what is the pot, how can that be divided, and also how are you making sure that, geographically it's represented well, but it's also kind of distributed in a way that's proportional?
Yeah, for sure. And we're just starting, and I remember like how the design process is still long, because we are deliberate in taking that time until we manage to hear lots of voice within the ecosystem. Otherwise, it will be just, we will find ourselves in that vicious, like, doing the same thing again and again. So that's also our ask from our donors. Number one, to give us more. Number two, to be patient with us, to trust us so that we can trust the local organizations in a way they deserve to be trusted, because they're the one who are close to the people, and they should be the one who make the decision on the funding. And from the local organization's point of view, the process should be relevant and, what can I say, beneficial, regardless of the funding outcome. like regardless of the final decision. The process itself should be useful enough for them. For that to happen, we really need funders who can give more for long time horizon and also be with us while we are navigating through that process. Because it's just learning by doing. We are tending to be pragmatic, but it's not easy. So it's a process, as has been said. Feminism is a process. Feminist approach is a process that involves trust, flexibility, a new way of reimagining or redefining success. I mean, often we are asked to come up with a theory of change, sitting on our computer, developing a proposal, getting the money, recruiting the local partners, and do it that way. We don't have that chance to listen from the people and even co-define or co-create the success. How that success is measured is another aspect of it, and whose knowledge is really counting. I mean, there is knowledge out there with the local organizations and local community, but whose knowledge is really counting is something that we would like to change, and I hope we can make it.
Thanks for that candid answer, but it also opens up a lot of questions, I think, Yes, we all want to do that, but what is the way of sort of, looking at really things one by one and unpacking all of them? Ankit, I want to come to you next. How is this sort of factoring into this conversation of, looking at different organizations across the board, and then looking at the idea of also decolonization, right? Like, this is a big word right now. It's almost a buzzword, but how does that factor into your work on a day-to-day basis, almost, if you could take us, again, behind the scenes?
Thank you. I'll respond to a couple of things as well. I think when you said fun is important in funding, I think that's so important. I think we don't realize that a lot of communities we work with are marginalized communities who have historic trauma, and we don't look at how our community is doing and their mental health. So as Global Fund for Women, we have been very intentional in also including healing justice as part of our work and making sure our grantee partners know that's something we fund. So for example, one of our grantee partners in Kisumu in Kenya, sex worker organization does beauty parlor Wednesdays, where they host beauty parlors for sex workers. And also use that space to talk about sex workers' rights and well-being, but just to come together as a community to have fun. And I think what's important for funders, as we're talking about it as well, Siva, I think we have to look at changing needs of young people and different communities. And as funders, we can't shy away from that. So when we're providing family planning services, we're providing information on SIHR, I think we have to look at how so many young people, especially LGBTIQ people, sex workers, are increasingly injecting drugs. They're increasingly exploring different forms of recreational drugs. So what kind of harm reduction services are we providing them so they also can use them safely? They have needles if they need. They have information on safe injection of drugs. Its intersection with sex and drugs. So I think that's something we are increasingly looking at, because I think soon we won't be able to ignore it for too long. And we've let our grantee partners know that we fund harm reduction as a service as well, or they could use our funding for that as well. Yeah, and I think we have to look at feminist funding from an intersectional lens. I think we can't just be saying we fund trans people or we fund this group. I think there's intersecting marginalization. So we've, as Global Fund for Women, we are increasingly reaching out to Dalit trans women's groups in India, for example. We're providing them support they need. If they want to submit a proposal in language we don't support, hiring translators for them. So I think all of these changing needs need to be recognized. We talk about sex workers, looking at younger sex workers, I think if you talk about young people doing sex work, it's just something nobody knows how to navigate. It's not easy for us as well, because there's different laws. But I think these are communications we need to have, because if we're saying we support SIHR for everyone, then it really does have to be everyone in this ecosystem.
Right. I think, Ankit, you bring up a really important point of sort of funding across movements and funding across sort of different verticals, right? And this is something that all sectors struggle with, not just, SRHR, across in global health, all sectors sort of struggle with this. So, Althea, if I could come to you and talk, if you could talk about how, as a funder, you're looking at sort of, looking at this whole idea as a broad spectrum and not just specific organizations or specific movements that you're funding.
I think it's a really important question. As I mentioned earlier, we've gone through these strategy refreshes, but they're thematically focused. One is on governance, one is on SRHR, one is on women's economic empowerment. And one thing we realized like after was like, even within these thematic areas and giving general operating support, like are we still able to resource feminist movements holistically? So we were able to start just this year, a very pilot funding. It's $3 million. Now, I know this is a lot of money, but given our budget, it is a small amount of money to figure out what would be Hewlett's kind of role and contribution to the feminist funding ecosystem beyond these thematic areas. And we decided, and we would work program officers across these different teams to say, like, what types of investments we would make in this first year that could inform possibly a longer new area of programming. And so we decided this year to fund convenings. We said these are opportunities for us to, one, share our intentions of entering this space with our values, humbly, in learning mode, as well as to respond to something that is often not supported in the field, is convening across different movements. And what we have funded three different, four. We have the Human Rights Funders Network. We funded Urgent Action Fund Africa's Feminist Festival. We funded Southern Feminist Futures, and then a fund to Women Deliver for the convening next year. Very different types of spaces, but these are opportunities for different actors to come together and talk about what it means to actually be successful in cross-movement work. As a foundation, this is what we've decided to do in the first year. We are listening, we are learning, and then as we move forward, this is only our first year, we will decide like what new types of investments do we want to make. Again, being really clear that we understand that we don't have any history explicitly in doing this, so we need to go slowly and learn and really consult with the field, consult with our peer funders who have been doing this work for a longer period of time, and then decide what is our contribution.
Right. Siva and Bing, before we go into audience questions, since there are donors here who are listening, if you could talk about what you would want from donors going forward.
We want, what is that support would look like for us. We know for a fact that investing in women or giving us women's organization, feminist organization money is not the solution. It should be, it should be based on having to understand, respecting the fact that change actually happened for a long term. It should be sustainable. It should actually be flexible. It should also look into the core funding because, to be honest, most of organizations are not being seen as having people at the backbone of it. Other funding facilities doesn't even, gives out money for personal, which is very, very sad because how can you actually really do things when you don't have people to work with you? And I see people nodding because they experience this. And I think, yeah, I think when we are, I've said this earlier, that when you want to transform realities of people, it has to be sustainable. It has to be long-term. It has to be work directly at the collectives, at the very basic collectives of feminist organizations, also work to people who are doing dissent work. Because, to be honest, in most contexts where there is a rise of authoritarian rule, dissent is very, very important. Women human rights defenders are in the forefront. They are putting our lives in the forefront to make sure that our rights are actually protected, fulfilled, and we demand for that accountability. And I think, again, it underpins to the fact that what I'm saying and appealing is that we have to be very accountable, both as organizations and also as funders. What are this money goes to really? Is this really for transformative change? Or is it something like, do this project for 5 years, for 2 years, and tell me how many condoms did you actually distribute? Is that impactful enough? Yes, it is. But is that sustainable? No.
I think that, so there are many asks we have, actually. And I think one is to always understand, I mean, like, I know that, funders go towards outcomes. We are also moving towards outcomes. But in today's context, progress is not always linear. We have a very kind of academic approach to progress, right? So we think that today we're in grade 1, 2 years' time I'm going to be in grade 2, and 5-year time I'm going to be in university, and and in 10 years' time I'm going to be a medical doctor, and my organization is sustainable and it's got different revenue streams, okay? But the kind of context we are living in, especially for SRHR, is like, you could be like the United States, where you're in, you're something like in university, and then now you're in kindergarten, right? I mean, post Roe v. Wade, right? So, and this is happening all the time in our context, with the economic cycles, which are much more rapid, the political and the socio-political cycles are also becoming demanding. So I think that, of course, I echo Bing's call for like core, flexible, and, we all know this, right? But also what kind of outcome we are funding is something that we need to think about. The second is, like, as Alethea said, I mean, yes, when there's funding for women's human rights, every organization is somehow a women's human rights organization. When there's funding for feminist organizations, suddenly everyone is a feminist organization. And then when they're funding intersectionality, everyone's an intersectional organization, right? And then and everyone's involved in decolonization, et cetera, et cetera. But I just want to have this reminder. The time has come that if we co-opt the language, we need to do the language, So the thing is, just do justice to the language, the perspective, and the ideology that we are professing out there, and the change can be made, And I'm not asking funders to go and say, oh, you're a grade A feminist organization, you're a grade B. That doesn't help, but that we are all in this process of transformation. And, and we have to answer to ourselves. I mean, I know that, I run an organization, so I'm asked about sustainability of the organization, sustainability of the agenda. What does that look like? The agenda is sustainable when women, young people, marginalized communities hold the power in their hands, to hold their service providers, to hold their governments accountable. That's the outcome we have to work towards, and our success looks like when we don't need to have organizations doing that anymore.
Thank you, Siva. We have about 10 minutes for Q&A. So yeah, if you have any questions, oh my God, I see hands up already. Will 10 minutes be enough? We'll see. Can we have mics passed around, please? Oh, there.
Behind the camera are mics.
Oh, there are mics. So if you could just queue up to the mics, I think that'll be great.
Good afternoon. Thank you to all the panelists. I think a missing stakeholder in the conversation is the power that boards have on philanthropies and in nonprofits. And they hold an incredible amount of power, both in terms of financial capital and the strategic directions of the organizations and the way that they are guided to go. And they're often among the least diverse group of members in the development sector. So I'm curious what the panelists have in terms of thoughts and experiences on how to create feminist boards and feminist governance practices at philanthropies and nonprofits. Thank you.
Okay, so I have the mic. I'm going to use my power because my hand was up to be able to speak. Thank you very much, all the panelists, for your insights. And sitting here listening to all of you in terms of you really feminist philanthropy and feminism as a whole, one thing is clear that we have started the conversation, that we are all thinking about who has power, how is it used, how is it abused, and how can we ensure that the people that we are advocating for on the ground are the ones that are getting the money, they are getting the money. So for me, really, in thinking about it, my question would go to all of you, and especially Althea, in terms of how do you ensure the feminist practices and principles that you have now envisioned and you're working towards, that also that one trickles down to organizations like Arrow, Siva that is leading, and WGNNR and PSI, such that as they are, and of course, Global Fund for Women, so that then as you're trying to also ensure that the money goes to the community grassroots, they are doing the same. They are embodying your feminist principles and values to ensure that we get to a point where fundraising, proposal writing will be fun, as she's mentioned, and that the criteria really embodies feminist principles, and that really the money goes to women, girls, and gender expansive person at the grassroots. How can you ensure that that happens, and what is that accountability mechanism? If you know, and what is your role at that level that also trickles down to the grassroots level? So just in terms of really accountability, and also for the three of you, PSI, Arrow, and WGNNR, how do you also ensure that in Global Fund for Women, who've been doing this work for such a long time, but really focusing on the three of you, how do you ensure then that also happens and really works, you know, in how you support grassroots organizations and movements? Thank you.
We'll take one more question, have a round of answers, and then go to questions again.
Oh, thank you so much. My name is Nelly. I work for a local organization in Kenya. And my question goes to Althea and also basically to the organizations represented. A lot of times we've seen funders funding INGOs, and they look at their capacity and they look at their structures within. So for me, my question will be, do you get opportunities to talk to the people that are funded, for example, at the community level, the grantees that probably PSI will be funding a local organization such as myself? And how do you make sure that they are engaged in the whole process of even proposal development and the accountability in terms of ensuring that there's a balance even in funding so that they're not getting a 20% and they are the real implementers, they do the donkey work, and ensure that even their own capacity is strengthened. I had someone mention that they do not, who is doing the donkey work, who is providing the story, who is giving the reality on the ground? Are we using them as dummy pigs, or we are providing an opportunity for them to share platforms with Althea, for example? Thank you.
Those are great questions. Althea, you want to go first with that last one, and then we can
Yes.
back.
So I'm going to just say, like, that particular part for Hewlett specifically is very difficult for multiple reasons. One, we don't have country or regional offices. We are based in the Bay Area of Northern California. And we have a lean staffing model. So we have 2 people on our global reproductive equity team. So to really, like, one, find partners who are working at the grassroots and be able, like, given the level of funding that they're asking for, very hard. Most of our grants are like $500,000 to like multiple millions of dollars. And then, like, if you are going to decide to partner with an organization that is values aligned, and then try to understand what their relationship is with their partners. One of the things we've tried to do, like, there are some solutions, but it's still very difficult, is to invite sub-grantee partners, grassroots organizations who are onward granting partners into proposal development conversations, into reporting conversations, into our strategy development process. We just held a convening of our partners this morning, and all sub-grantees were invited to that meeting so that we are doing shared learning together. I think in the proposal development, just to tell you, like, how hard that has been, a lot of our work is in Francophone West Africa. I don't speak French, one. And I'm also not overseeing that portfolio. But like when I want to have a conversation with a partner working in Francophone West Africa and they're bringing 15 other partners, we provide interpretation services. But what that also means is like it's going to take a long time to schedule 15 different organizations on a call, give people enough space to have an opportunity to share what they do, because that's what you invited them to do, and then to continue that as frequently as we have a conversation. So honestly, maybe we're able to talk once a year, maybe I make it to a country once a year, and so that type of accountability that you're talking about is super difficult if that's all the time we have together, right? At some point, you're trusting that if someone says, we work with these principles, we have a reputation in the field of working this way, that's going to have to be enough at some point, because adding a whole nother layer of accountability is going to require much more time that in some ways takes away from the work. But I do agree that it's also very important to have that type of accountability.
Ankit, do you want to take the question about accountability from donors to other partners that you then go on to work with?
Sure. I don't have a lot to add on this. I think this is a good question. We do, at Global Fund for Women, we are thinking about feminist governance. We are right now going through a feminist redesign, redesign structure where we are engaging external partners to look at how do we ensure our organizational design is feminist, like how are we building leadership of younger people in the organization, newer staff in the organization. So also having a more horizontal structure going on. We've done work in consultation with partners a lot. We developed a safeguarding policy recently and an anti-corruption policy, which was done in consultation with grantee partners. Partners who are engaged on that process were, I think, paid an honorarium as well. I think it's a process. I think we're still thinking about it. But I think for us it's difficult sometimes because the language around safeguarding, the language around corruption is difficult for so many of our grantee partners who we fund, because we really want to understand when is it corruption versus when is it an issue of a capacity, or when is it just people not being enough to respond to financial management. So I think it's difficult, but we're trying to arrive somewhere on that process.
Right. Siva, do you want to take the question about boards? Yeah, okay.
Yeah, I think that I do know, because I do have many friends who work in the INGO nonprofit sector, who are really working very hard to try to transform their own organizations, and very often they are, small groups and marginalized groups within their own organization. So I was thinking like, perhaps you all can think of a structure like what corporations have done, right? To have 2 or 3 activist positions within the boards. And we do know in some organizations like Unilever, for all of the ills that they do, like some of those work around, palm oil and, where they source their palm oil from, or shifting it to different, like more human rights friendly areas, countries, So I think that these are some of those positions that just because it's a nonprofit or an NGO or an INGO does not mean that that board does not need activists on it. So that can be something that you can think of, introducing into that, which might be useful.
Yeah.
Right. I think we have time for 3 more questions before we stop. Okay.
Yes,
Let's
just
see, you want to respond?
Yeah, on the accountability part, it's just to explain a little bit on what we do right now. So as I said earlier, the Maverick Impact Portfolio started in 2020, but we still don't have a defined theory of change, because we would like to co-create that theory of change. We would like to give the chance for our local partners to define success for themselves. So it's time-taking, and it requires patience, but doing it that way or flipping the process could be one way of doing it. And when we define the theory of change, it also involves metrics, how our key performance indicators are defined again or co-created. That way could be one way of doing it. I just want to add this. Thank you.
Thank you. And Bing, you'd like to respond
Yes, I'm aware that there's a long queue, but I also wanted to respond on the question about how do we support grassroots communities? How do we work directly to them? We do work with them. We do work alongside with them, and we are a grassroots organization that works directly at the national community and at the regional and global level. How do we do that? We we know for a fact that the narrative and the realities of the grassroots can should be it should be bottom up approach, and then it trickle down again. I would just just to cite an example for now, how do we provide that platform for the grassroots communities and grassroots organizations to be heard, to have that opportunities to share the realities. I would say that we have now in the room the youth advocates for SRHR from the Philippines who have been working with us for the past few years to be able to have that leadership in SRHR. And that for us is actually really, one of the examples where you go directly where the most, the need is, needed. I mean, yeah, you know what I mean.
Thank you. Yes. We
It's
have
English.
Okay, good morning, everyone. So I'm Charlène Sozest. I'm coming from Le Planning Familial, which is a French feminist organization. I'm sorry, I'm not speaking English very well, but I will try to make myself understand. So I definitely share what have been said this morning by the panelists, but also by the attendant. I want just to insist on the fact that it's really different feminist organization, grassroots organization, and NGOs that working on gender issues. And we know that we all are important on the scale. We have a lot of work to do, so we all matter. But we really need support as feminist organization, and donors need to review the criteria, make them more accessible for really women-led organization, Black feminist organization, queer people organization, make sure that the mechanism will be understandable for them, accessible also in Francophone. I know it's hard, but there is a lot of work, especially in West African countries, and they need support, So make sure that we will have funding also for French-speaking countries. Funding not only through call to projects, but also to help structure, to organize themselves, to develop themselves. For me, it will be already a win. We were talking about what will be successful. Help feminist organization to structure themselves, to hire employee will be a success. Because, for example, my organization, we are providing healthcare services, but most of our organization is working with volunteers, and it's great to have volunteers, but to be feminist, it's pay people for their work and pay feminist organization for their work. We were saying there was new money from the GEF, but actually not all of this money are new. They are recycling. So we need also new funding, and material funding, yes, are new funding. And at the end, I just want to raise a last point for feminist organization based in northern country, because most of the time we think that, okay, they are in democratic country, in like-minded countries, so they have support, etc., etc. It's not true. We are doing work, we are facing harassment from anti-choice organization. We are facing harassment from even members of the government, because we are tackling patriarchy, because we are tackling so many dynamics of domination power, and we need support. So yeah, my last call will be also helping feminist organization of northern countries, because we are losing space, and there is a lot of anti-choice that raising and access to power, and yeah, we need to defeat them.
Thank you. Are there more questions? Okay, there you go.
Hi. My question is about philanthropy in general. So most organizations, philanthropic organizations in the US, have to pay out 5%, the bare minimum, to maintain their charitable status. When you have multi-billions of dollars, that 5% is quite small. And one thing I've heard over and over during the session is the need for funding and competition for funding. I was thinking about the Mackenzie Scott grants, and an organization that I really adore got a grant, and they were able to start an endowment, and they were able to become a little bit more self-sufficient, to rely less on needing to apply for grants. What can we learn from that? And do we think we should put pressure on philanthropic organizations to spend down? Or is there a need for philanthropic organizations to exist in perpetuity? And before anyone gets upset, it's not the program officers, it's not the program associates who make this decision, it is the boards, mostly.
One more question and then we can go from there.
Okay, again? Yeah. Can I just pull it out? Oh, perfect. Thank you, yes. Mine, thank you to everyone, to the panelists, and mine is actually more of a point of reflection and a point of concern. I'm Phyllis Mbeke. I work with Women's Spaces Africa, a feminist disability-led organization. What targeted interventions are you donors putting for us as people with disabilities to access this money? Over time, sometimes we get marginalized unconsciously. However, we have family planning, we do want to get pills, we do have abortions, we are queer women with disabilities, we are sex workers. What targeted and purposeful interventions are you having for us as people with disabilities? Thank you.
Thank you. And is there one more question? Did you have a question as well? Yeah, go for it.
Thank you. First of all, thank you. I think this was one of the most candid conversations that we've heard, and some of us have been there since the Youth Pre-Conference, so really, really congratulations to all the panelists and to the moderator. I was also very pleased to see that there was a reference to young people and investments in young people. Do want to encourage just an invitation to think on, when we say young people as a constituency, are we also looking at youth-led organizations? Because also in the feminist funding space, a lot of times youth-led organizations are left out or are sort of in that space, but we always need a parent organization to be then sort of, because there is, while we talk about trust, but are we really investing enough in youth-led organizations and their capacities to take funding? But my question really is that what are, as funders, as people who hold philanthropic spaces, what is the kind of investment that we can actually make in, and with full humility and respect, what's the kind of investment we can make in making the funders really come and evolve with us in the kind of discourses that are evolving? So for example, in the gender-based violence funding, while there's a lot of funding that will now come on and has been coming on engaging men and boys, but not on masculinities, because if it's talking about masculinities, it does not talk about trans masculinities. If it's coming on gender-based violence, it's not talking about queer rights. And we sort of do get left out in those spaces because the definitions that often that come with, say, gender-based violence, then are not coming beyond violence against women. And I think that's very, very important of how do funders really evolve with us as the discourse is evolving, because we have gone ahead, and you're right that there are many buzzwords that are coming in, but how do we really unpack some of those and make those as principles beyond just like as action words?
Thank you so much. We just got a reminder that we have 3 minutes. So we'll have 3 of you answering 3 of those questions real quick. Do you want to take the disability one? Yeah.
I can talk about youth-led groups. I think I completely agree, and again, disability as well. But let me first talk about the Pableen's question. I think, yeah, you're absolutely right. I think funders need to fund more youth-led groups, and I think that needs to be packaged with other support, like capacity building support. And I think as Global Fund for Women, it is one of our equity indicators. Every year, when we produce our grant-making docket, we look at the percentage of youth-led groups we fund. We also very specifically focus on adolescent girls-led group. We have an Adolescent Girls Advisory Council, which is our participatory grant-making committee that funds, which is all adolescent girls, and they decide on adolescent girls groups to fund. And I think that's adolescent girls is another area of neglect by funders, so that's something we do. And I think what you said about disability rights groups, absolutely agree. We've been trying to partner a lot more with disability justice groups, including the Disability Rights Fund. But I think it's not enough. I think as Global Fund for Women, we are also acknowledging that we need to do more, and we do try to.
Thank you. We have the question about philanthropists and how do we make sure that they're sustainable
Can I talk about
and their
volunteerism?
funding.
So, two things. The debate around the 5%, that is a longer conversation. I'm happy to go into it. There's only 1 minute left. The thing I would want to say, if there's the volunteerism has to end in this sector. This is absurd. Like, the fact that we expect people in the public sector, in civil society, to work for no money, to do this because, like, you want to better your community in the U.S., anywhere else in the world. People need to be compensated for their time and their work, and they also need retirement so that they can lead the movement at some point and be able to rest.
Thank you so much. Siva, you want to?
Yeah, I just wanted to say that, firstly, on the philanthropy sector, I think that the world is constantly creating billionaires, it seems. So firstly, these billionaires need to pay taxes instead of, like, what is it? And tax justice and tax reform is a feminist agenda as well. Yeah, so that's one. And then I think that, that would really, kind of help. So that's my.
Great, thank you. Bing, I know we had scheduled time for a call to action from everyone, but do you want to just put one call to action on behalf of the panel? We have about a minute left.
I cannot actually say on behalf of the panel, but I would say that they would agree with this, that please invest in the most marginalized and also those who are most impacted by injustices and inequalities. We do need service delivery. That's the most needed urgent relief, but we also need advocacy because we need to transform the system. We need to transform the system because all we know that many of us here, our system simply doesn't work.
Thank you so much. Thanks to all of you for being here. Thank you.